Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the final session of Femtech Leaders 2021. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the final panel, Filling the Gender Data Gap. And if the conversations that this is touched upon in the last 2 days are anything to go by, this is one that you definitely won't want to miss. So I'm going to hand you over to Kelly, who's our moderator, and she can kick off the session. Kelly, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Becky. So welcome everyone, you've made it. Thank you for attending this final panel session on day 2. As Becky mentioned, we're going to be discussing filling the gender data gap, navigating privacy, education and innovation. My name is Kelly McMullon and I'm a special counsel in Proskau's London office. So I'm the lawyer on the panel. I provide data protection advice to a variety of businesses, including in the life sciences space. And as Becky mentioned, as everyone in the audience is no doubt aware, despite representing half the population, we have a big gender data gap in terms of research and where we don't have information and therefore a lack of understanding on women and women's health. And throughout the panel sessions we've heard across the 2 days, constantly it's always mentioned that data is critical here. It's an untapped area. In this panel, we'll be looking at some of the challenges and obstacles in collecting that data to plug those gaps. And we have an excellent panel of speakers from a range of different businesses in the women's health and femtech space to work through this topic with us. I'll ask each of our panelists in a second to introduce themselves more fully, but we have Jill Waldner from Evidation, Riddhi Tarial from NextGen Jane, and Eric Dye from Bloom Life. So as a start, let's turn to Jill, and if you could just explain a little bit more fully about what Evidation does, introduce us to your business, and then also the types of data you're collecting and interacting with at Evidation.
Sure, thanks Kelly, and thanks for having me. So Evidation Health, our mission, probably I guess I'll start with that, is to empower individuals to participate in better health outcomes. And we do that by focusing on measurements of everyday health and leveraging that to better characterize and understand health outside the clinic walls. So how can we better characterize an individual's disease, looking at longitudinal data to better understand disease impact, and therapeutic impact. We do this by measuring passive data as well as active data from individuals. And we have a large focus, I guess I should start with our large focus on really a foundation of privacy and control over permissioned health data. And so any of our participants consent use of the data, and then we use that data to better understand and characterize the individual's health over time.
Great, thanks, Jill. And Riddhi, let's hear a little bit more about NextGen Jane and what you're doing.
Sure, yeah. Riddhi Tarial, co-founder and CEO of NextGen Jane. We're a biotech startup. We're trying to transform female reproductive health through better data and a more profound molecular understanding of conditions that affect female-born bodies. We do this by creating a unique catalog of consumers, which we call the menstrualome. And you can think of the menstrualome as being made up of 3 pillars. I always like to go through these 3 pillars because you'll understand what the data types that we collect are by understanding what they are. The first one is one that we're probably the most known for, which is the smart tampon system. This is how we transport a tampon from the privacy of an individual's bathroom to our labs with no cold chain, but great preservation of RNA, DNA, and intact cells. The second pillar of the menstrualome is once we get that tampon back to the lab, we actually are extremely ambitious and platform agnostic as to how and what types of molecular data we generate from it. So we end up creating terabytes of data per sample, that is provided by the smart tampon system, which is unique to the cells that are shed, from the female reproductive tract every single month. That is the natural biopsy that is menstruation. And this data is, transcriptomics, small RNA, methylation, microbiome data. So really, really broad set of data about the cells that you shed from your female reproductive tract. The final pillar of the menstrualome is the deep health context we establish for your unique life experience. We do this through a survey instrument. It's in part, we created this instrument because of our understanding of the genomic data that we're generating is only as good as our understanding of the phenotypic characteristics that make up who you are. And what I mean by phenotypic characteristics is what's your ethnic background, what's your age, your diet, your stress level, your environmental exposure, your exercise routine, your family history of disease. All of these facts about yourself are maintained in some disparate set of resources, probably some in your phone, some in your doctor's EMR, et cetera. We're trying to build a way to integrate that information into a single repository to inform your health. Ultimately, the goal with all three of these that make up the menstrualome is so that we can move past diagnosing female disorders through gross anatomical features and really begin to understand female reproductive pathology at a molecular level.
Really, really interesting work. And Eric, finally, for last but no means least.
Yeah, great. It's great to be here with everyone. My name is Eric D. I'm co-founder and CEO of Bloom Life. We're a maternal health company that's focusing on developing remote prenatal care solutions to improve the health of women and babies. Our particular focus is on high-risk pregnancies. At this point, about 20% of all pregnancies are considered high risk, and they drive about 60% of the $110 billion spent annually in the US on maternity care. And our focus has been developing solutions that improve access to care. We believe an increasing amount of prenatal care will move into the home, thereby improving access, especially for those that live in underserved communities, and also helping address the massive shortage of maternal health care providers we find in the US. So there's a well-documented shortage of maternal health care providers, and women living in over 50% of the US are effectively maternity care deserts. And so we're at a stage right now where technologies are mature enough that they can shift a lot of what has traditionally been done in a clinical setting to the home. And our focus in developing the underlying technology to enable that. So what we do is we combine connected device with data analytics. Part of our solution is a proprietary wearable device. It's a sensor that's worn on the belly that non-invasively measures various physiological signals of maternal fetal health. It functions very similar to like a cardiac monitoring patch. So we measure maternal EKG, fetal EKG, and maternal EHG, which is electrohysterography, that's uterine activity. And then with signal processing algorithms, you could extract out parameters that are used in clinical practice today, such as fetal heart rate and contractions, which is what essentially make up a cardiotogogram, as well as look at other maternal health risk factors that have been shown in medical literature to impact risk of things such as preterm birth, but which we lack good tools to assess today. So you can think about maternal stress, maternal sleep being two conditions that significantly increase risk of preterm birth if you have disorders there. So part of what we collect is this physiological data longitudinal throughout pregnancy. Our platform also allows for the collection of other data from third-party devices. So if you have a high-risk pregnancy, you also might need to measure your blood pressure. We can measure blood pressure. We could take in data from blood glucose monitors if you might have gestational diabetes. And of course, all this is augmented by clinical surveys that also allow you to sort of assess how the woman's doing. So that's kind of the corpus of the data we collect from the home. And then we are also looking at capturing real-world clinical outcomes. So what was the birth outcome of the baby? And the whole sort of picture of this data is if you start to have these longitudinal data sets with actual birth outcomes, how can you start mining that data with AI and ML algorithms to start finding better ways to do risk stratification, personalizing care, and ultimately earlier identifying acute events to prevent things such as a preterm birth or potentially even a stillbirth. So that's what we've been focusing on.
So I think we can clearly see we're collecting a lot of data points across the panel, and I guess it's a somewhat obvious question or perhaps an obvious answer, but I think it's important to set the conversation in the context of why is this data so important to your business, to Femtech, to women's health? Why the need for so many data points? Riddy, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. I think that, every field of scientific inquiry is plagued by missing data, which is variables without observations, which, skew your ability to actually understand trends and find out what's happening. It's especially egregious in women's health. And I mean from as early on as most mouse models are male mouse models and not female mouse models. I mean, talk about the foundational starting of lack of data when it comes to female reproductive biology, but all the way down to most clinical trials enroll predominantly men, predominantly white men, right? And so that means that drugs and interventions that are tested, most of that data is relevant to male-born bodies, all the way down to their, for us, even the types of questions that people ask about female reproductive health are limited by shame and stigma. And so, obviously we are a company that's deeply involved in menstrual disorders, for example. And so questions like, how many times do you change your tampon? How often do you plan your exit plan, when you're on your period, to the closest bathroom because you're anxious about it? All these questions, that they are not generally asked of patients or consumers. And that leads to this lacuna and this gap in our understanding of menstrual disorders and menstruation. And I think that the reason that it's important is because it's the reason that we have such gaps in our understanding for diseases that impact predominantly women. So for example, why is it that autoimmune diseases are generally 90% of the time manifested in female-born bodies? Or why is it that mostly women suffer from chronic Lyme disease? Or now, most recently, why is it that it's mostly women who have long COVID? These are questions that are extremely relevant to this population, and yet we're not going to get anywhere close to answering it if we're not asking the right questions. We're not recruiting these individuals into clinical trials, and even our animal models are not representative of their biology.
Yeah. And if I could just maybe add something that because I think I really kind of highlighted this historical aspect of this. I don't think that it's not a question of whether or not this data is important for women's health. The data is important for all aspects of anyone's health. I think the main point is that this is an area that's been so massively overlooked. And as she pointed out, even from the early sort of basic animal models. And I mean, we work in maternal health, and I think part of the reason why women's health has been underfunded, aside from many other aspects, is historically, back in the 70s, when there was clinical research still included pregnant women, and then there was a thalidomide incident where these women ended up having babies with severe birth defects. Effectively, it blocked pregnant women from being involved in clinical research, and that just expanded to be all women. And even when that policy was reversed in the 90s, and the NIH started mandating that companies include women in their clinical studies, it still has taken a very long time to overcome that. And so I think, for me, I think what's interesting right now, and I think it's represented by all the companies here, is that we're entering a very interesting phase of healthcare. And what we're seeing in women's health mirrors, I think, the trends we've seen in other aspects of tech. And what I mean is that, Google launches a search engine that provides solves a specific problem for consumers, but in the background, they're collecting all this data to understand and predict behaviors. And Tesla launches a self-driving electric vehicle that has some self-driving features, but in the end, they're trying to improve all these algorithms. In women's health, we're not having companies like all of ours that are launching products that address immediate user need, but in the background, it's starting to collect all this information and starting to use this way of accelerating this data capture to close the data gap that we have in this area, to see how do we actually collect the foundational information to improve our ability to understand the health of women, right? And start to see how do we better predict things? How do we better understand and contextualize what's happening for women's health? And it's just, I think, a pretty exciting time period where the technology, the user need, all these different aspects are kind of colliding at the same time and creating, I think, some pretty unique opportunities for accelerated innovation. Yeah.
The thing I'd add to that is, I think traditionally and historically, a lot of the data that is leveraged to understand health segment and things like that is all based on sort of the traditional clinical data that is captured at a point in time. And we as individuals are living our day through living every day, right, through life, generating far more information that's relevant to understanding our specific health, our specific preferences. And I think we're at a place now where we have the ability to capture that information, where we're generating information outside of the clinic that is, incredibly useful to better understanding an individual in different ways. So I think what Eric said is it's not just important for women's health, it's important for all health. And I think to the extent that you can better understand people at an individual level and characterize those individuals, whether it's women or any other segment, you're able to better understand various and investigate various impacts from a disease perspective. And importantly, I'll switch to this because I think we talked about the understanding and characterization of disease, but it's also empowering better outcomes. To the extent that we better understand an individual, their preferences, what motivates them, you also can make sure that you're tailoring what the right interventions are in order to take them to the right outcome. So how do we make sure we're meeting people where they are, understanding what their health is and what needs to be done, and providing them the insights in a way that helps them take ownership and activate and better outcomes.
I think that actually leads nicely on into sort of the, moving on to the next sort of topic area is actually all of this is personal now. It's not the large data sets. They form part of a large data sets, but we're talking about personal data. And I think managing the innovative aspects and the privacy aspects must be something that your business have all had to deal with in the setup right from the very start. So I don't know, Eric, do you want to just comment on how Bloom Life looked at that and how you've been managing that innovation / privacy dichotomy, or even if it is a dichotomy for you?
Yeah, and for us, it's certainly a work in progress. We had an earlier version of our product that was available direct to consumers or direct to patient that we use to sort of start collecting a large part of our data set that we have right now. And in that model, everything was opt-in, but it was hard, right? Because in the end, if someone opts in and they decide they want to opt out, like we're not set to at scale be able to like adjust those things. So it's a very kind of labor intensive process. But I think, what we try to do is be as transparent as we can over, the data we're collecting, what we want to use the data for, and just, doing it in a very kind of human-centered way that's sort of is not sort of full of legalese. But it's not easy. And then as we start to think about moving into the more clinical domain, of course, then you've got different concerns that you need to also manage regarding patient privacy, HIPAA. And so we have to be compliant with all those as we move into the clinical domain. And ultimately, as we start to look at using some of the data for some more interesting sort of data science purposes, we're eventually getting to the point where many of these things will have to be done under an IRB approved study. And so there'll be sort of additional oversight there, but it's challenging. I mean, the solutions we're building are hard enough to build in and of themselves, and to really figure out all of the different architecture requirements necessary to really have a fully scalable opt-in, opt-out sort of modifiable system is just something else to build. And so I'm hoping that some people are already building these things and we can start to leverage them in the future, but it is tricky. But I think it is incredibly important because that trust that you need to actually, for people to use your product, to be able to share their data is foundational. But frankly speaking, from what we've seen, that there is a desire to share things if it's for the greater good, especially in this area. There's almost like a community of moms that really, especially those that have experienced any sort of complication, that they kind of bond together and they want to be able to share their own experience. And I think that extends into the types of data that we were able to collect.
Jill, did you? How does Evidation look at this?
Yeah, I think Eric said it nicely. I think that at the foundation of the way that so at our core is everything that we do is permissioned health data. So anything that we capture is consented by the individual. And I think the power of what you can get from this data is dependent on us capturing it and our ability to do that. We have a significant commitment and responsibility to make sure that we're protecting that data and making sure that the individual understands exactly how that data is being used. I think a lot of it comes back to kind of what Eric said at the start of transparency. So to the extent that you're completely transparent and individuals know what data is being captured, how it's being used, who has access to it, and they're permissioning that use and consenting that use, I think people want to use their data for good, right? And so I think to the our goal is how do we help people participate in the research and to continue to encourage people to do that. It's just about being transparent in how that data is being used and making sure we're staying true to that.
And I think really last week we were talking about user experience. Within that, you were talking about the various data points.
Oh, Kelly, I think you muted yourself accidentally.
I have indeed. Thanks, Riddy. I was just asking you, Riddy, last week we were talking about the various data points that you collect at NextGen Jane, and just sort of the user experience within that, and how you manage that from both getting the results you want whilst also getting the data you want, and also like talking to the individual and the individual's concerns.
For sure. I think that there are two things that I mentioned that are key to point out for NextGen Jane. One is all of our studies and data collection efforts are IRB approved, meaning that there is a consent process upfront that sort of tries to explicate and walk every participant through individually, like on the phone over Zoom meetings, to say, here's exactly what we're going to do with your data. Here's what you're signing up for. Here's how you can revoke those rights. And it is a more intense and laborious process. To Eric's point, it can start to slow down all of your efforts that you're doing if you're upfront committing the time to having an actual conversation with each individual that is opting into your system to make sure that they understand what they're opting into. So that's sort of time intensive in the beginning. And the second thing from a user experience perspective is that our survey instruments that collect self-reported data take about an hour, if not an hour plus, to fill out. And we're sort of very upfront about that as well, to say, look, science and understanding all of these complicated, confounding things is difficult. And so if we want to do this right, we're going to have to collect a lot of information, right? Everything from background to lifestyle to medication to we have specific sections that go into autoimmune disorders, environmental exposures. Do you have endometriosis? Do you have these menstrual disorder factors? So it's pretty thorough, and we sort of deliberately do that trade-off. We say, we're going to ask you to do a very long, intensive thing, and we're going to take some time individually to make sure you understand what you're actually participating in by consenting you through it step by step. And the reason that we do that is because of the context of past experience in women's health. So some of the things that we take into account when we say, all right, why are we spending this much time in this process, making it more laborious maybe than it needs to be. One is their experiences, like in women's health specifically. So for example, there is a company called Glow that collected period tracking, fertility tracking, and there were some pretty obvious privacy flaws where you could use very basic software to scrape personal information about their users from their site. This was in 2016 that caused sort of a fissure, amongst all of the fertility tracking apps, right? Because one company doing that actually has an impact on everybody else working in that space. Similarly, in 2018, Flow was another period tracking, fertility tracking app. A huge piece in the Wall Street Journal about how Facebook had access to their information and was using it for targeted ads, right? So again, if I'm a Flow user using it for improved pregnancy outcomes, did I permit Facebook to actually target me for ads or to sell that information to employers? No, I did not. So again, caused this fissure and this scarring of trust in the community, right? Even things like when GSK bought a stake in 23andMe, there were a lot of people who, even though they had permitted the data, right, they had signed consents, were sort of surprised that their information was being actually sold to a drug development effort. And for that, what we're trying to take into consideration is that even when you do all the right things, a misunderstanding of what you're actually consenting to can cause sort of scarring in the community. And so we're in part setting up these elaborate processes because we're responding to that environment. We're saying, listen, there's historical use cases, very recent historical use cases that could cause women specifically who have a history of having sort of, a contentious relationship with the medical system to feel scared about where their data is going and what it's being used for.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that one? Because I think it's a really good point. And I guess, how do you all think about finding that balance between, wanting to do right by your user, but also needing to operate your business, right? Because to a certain extent, like your 23andMe, you've done everything you possibly can to be super transparent upfront over exactly how things are going to be done. And I mean, I guess you could try to disclose exactly your business strategy to everyone, but at the same time, if you've kind of checked all the boxes and say you're consenting in, I mean, I think 23andMe did an amazing job. Also, like when you opt in, if your data was used in a publication, they send you the publication, say this is your publication, this is where your data. I mean, it's hard to like get much better. And so at some point, if you need to build a partnership, like how do you manage that, right? Because in the end, it's like you kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And it seems like, drawing from what you're all saying, transparency here is key.
Yeah, so probably transparency, and then, you know, there's probably a bit of, you know, reconsenting as well, right? So if you've got a population that you are continuing to engage with, you know, as things evolve and as things change, are you reconsenting along the way if something becomes more defined? I think that kind of fits into the transparency piece. I agree and like the idea that if you've got a two-way kind of communication with the people that you're engaging with, to let you know, so that they understand how the information is being used and what the output was, I think is important. And I think there's a piece of it that's just integrity. You know, I think to Riddy's point of, you know, scenarios where, you know, some companies in this space have maybe used the data and sold it for more kind of advertising purposes and targeted advertising and things like that. To the extent that you continue to, we have a lot of integrity with how we're using the data, and it's ultimately true with what we know we're consenting. I think that's going to be also incredibly important. And as we all kind of continue to do that.
I think the other thing I'd toss in there is language. There's so much legalese out there now that it's hard to unpack it and make your way through what you're actually consenting to. And so a concerted effort to communicate what you're doing, what they're signing up for, and what their data will be used for in extremely lay language, and sort of bringing up the you know, legalese literacy of everyone who is going through terms of service or your actual consent. I mean, it's actually required if you do submit a consent or an assent to an IRB, for example, is that they make sure that language is understandable by like a very rudimentary reading level. And I think that would go a long way towards building trust as well.
Yeah, I like that point. That's good.
And we've had an interesting question here that I just wanted to bring up in this in this space right now, but we're talking about getting people to give you information, and the question was, are any of you considering ways to compensate users for the use of the data that you're collecting? Is that in progress, in motion?
Yeah,
further down the track, because presumably that will help perhaps with transparency, perhaps with also the missing data, Riddy, that you were mentioning earlier. Jill, I think you were about to come in.
Yeah, so part of the Evidation platform and the population that we engage, the people that enroll for kind of more on the consumer side, the Evidation achievement population, part of that is reward based, right? So what we do is we provide people an opportunity to share data and participate in research opportunities as they come about, and they earn points for doing that. Those points can be used to, you know, over time, can be traded in for a range of things, including, you know, gift cards donated to a charity of their choice and things like that. I wouldn't say it's, you know, so yeah, so it's a point system that people earn points as they go.
And similarly, you know, we have, again, because all of our data collection efforts are taken through ethics review oversight. One of the things that you have to navigate is you can't offer so much compensation that it's undue incentive, right? Because that's also, there's a conflict of interest there, but you want to offer enough such that you're compensating them for their time. So we actually do just compensate them directly and try to walk that path of making sure it's enough that you are acknowledging that they're contributing, but not so much that you're actually incentivizing people to do it against their will.
That's right. Yep.
And under all of our IRB studies, we follow a similar path with Riddy and NextGen Jane.
And then, so thinking about any the other challenges that you're facing on sort of the privacy innovation dichotomy, one of the things really that you were mentioning is just sort of the missing data aspect, and not having the right bits of data. How do you deal with that challenge?
I mean, you know, the most direct answer is we just ask directly. Again, I would encourage everyone to go to survey.nextgenjane.com. Sorry for the plug. You can log in and you can see we like literally ask everything from, not just the basic questions that every period tracking company asks, like how many days do you bleed, but from like texture to the ways that you feel during your period. I mean, that we've done a thorough canvassing of trying to figure out what is the totality of the menstrual experience. And we actually think that we have asked basically every question possible about what you could be experiencing during that time. And so just very directly, we've gone in and tried to resolve the missing data question by asking the questions that nobody else is asking.
And do you have to fill that out before you click submit?
You don't. And so, very good point, Kelly, which is that the most important thing for us is to provide people the agency to not answer anything that makes them uncomfortable. So literally on every single page of the survey, we make clear to say, if there's any question that you don't want to answer, the first thing that you should do is not answer it.
And Eric, in terms of that data, the user experience, the collection of data, how do you manage that with sort of the maternal aspect when you're looking at babies and quite an intense period of time as well?
Yeah, I mean, well, because we have a device, a lot of our data is collected, I guess, somewhat passively. I mean, you obviously need to put the device on, but once it's on, then we're sort of collecting physiological data. And for us, I think as already Jill had pointed out that, historically speaking, data has only been possible to collect at sort of point of care, or let's say in the doctor's office. But with, new, connected health solutions that are moving to the home, you open the possibility of not just getting a sort of spot check in time once a month, but actually being able to get longitudinal data at pretty regular basis. And then that time series of data is really what's critical to really start getting a better view of the evolution of a condition. And so for us, a lot of it happens passively. We do look at prompting clinical questions. But I think the biggest challenge for a lot of us is I think the potential and promise is there. And I think if you just look at, historically speaking, other therapeutic areas, that have developed a better understanding of underlying risk factors and causes, and precision medicine's moved along. It's all started with having a large data set, and we're just getting the data now. And it's going to take time to translate, to get the large enough data sets with real world outcomes, to build the algorithms, to start, developing the personalized care, to really translate those algorithms to clinical tools and validating them. There's a long development cycle ahead of us. And I think part of what's required is just a lot of patience from everyone to give the companies that are working in this area the time to develop the data, the solutions, to validate those solutions, and eventually get them into products that are being used in the marketplace. So I think there's a ton of potential, but I think we're still at the very early innings of it.
Jill, I think it looked like you wanted to join in there.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think what Eric said, I would agree with both comments. We're largely focused on capturing passive data as well, and integrate it with clinical data, environmental data, and the ability, because you're capturing it longitudinally, because you're capturing it passively, you have the ability to kind of proactively prompt for contextual information as needed. And so it does help fill in a lot of those gaps.
And to pick up on some earlier points that you were talking about in reputation and sort of data security, data risk, how are you managing that reputational aspect in terms of what you're doing, and what steps are you taking to provide that reassurance to the people that you're collecting data from? Eric?
Oh, yes. Sorry. I wasn't sure
Sorry.
you were just looking at me. It's like I said before, a lot of it's just trying to be upfront and transparent. We work with leading clinical research organizations globally. I think that's another way to sort of to attach ourselves to, preeminent academic research centers where the reputations are there, the oversight bodies are there. And I think that's kind of the best we've been able to do so far. I mean, I think at some point, we'd like to start being able to operationalize some of what other companies that are sort of much further along and better funded than us have been able to do in terms of being able to kind of circle back with everyone whose data has been used for research purposes. I think there's a lot of value there. Yeah, I think those are some of the core things that we've been doing so far, though.
Really, did you have any comments just on that data security sort of reputation angle?
Yeah, I mean, for data security, we try to be transparent about the methods that we have. You can go onto the survey and see what we do in order to ensure that the data is kept confidential and private, everything from de-identifying it to keeping it on an AWS HIPAA compliant server, to removing the data as soon as possible, to store it, offline, et cetera. But I think the reputation piece is more interesting and it's more critical and key, because once you build that trust, there is a much deeper relationship you can have with the consumer. And I think for us, one thing is we actually have that physical touch point, meaning whether pre-pandemic it was in person or post-pandemic it's virtual over Zoom. We actually do talk to every single person that basically participates in our research, and then we consent them into specific studies that have extremely clear mandates about what we're trying to disambiguate from a scientific perspective. And then finally, I think that one of the things that we hear back frequently from our participants is, I would like to know what the outcome of this was, and if at all possible, could I have this information back for me? And it's a very poignant point for me, because I can understand the desire to if you're actually participating in research, to find out what the results were. And we sort of have to have two approaches to it. One is when we're developing a clinical diagnostic, we can't give that information out while it's in R&D. You can imagine an ethics review board would say, this is not, you don't have like sensitivity, specificity, and accuracy around this information. You can't give it out yet. And so, there are certain things that we actually are try to be transparent about, to say, until this is, FDA approved, or until this has gone through rigorous peer review, it's actually worse for us to reveal this information to you. But what we do try to do is, for the survey, that's not a clinical diagnostic. We're just trying to anchor people and provide them context into what their menstrual experience is like compared to people like them. So someone who's the same age, same ethnicity, same birth control regimen, what's their period like? That would be useful information to any sort of individual. That we're actually committed to generating the reports that we can actually give that information directly back to the people who participate in the survey, as a way of, one, thanking them, and two, showing them the ROI of, almost a citizen science effort, to say we can only develop these standards for individual, at an individual personalized level, if enough people give us an N where we can actually have a reference range that makes sense for exactly the individual characteristics that make you up.
Yeah, and I think, kind of building on the reputation thing, we talked a lot about, the importance of individuals understanding the use of the data, individuals consenting to it, protecting privacy. So we talked a lot about that. I think there's a piece about this where, our vision and our mission is centered around the individual, and making sure that, everything we do reinforces that, and they see that, and they see the value we're providing. That also helps build the reputation. So your reputation can be based on the experience that individuals have when they interact with you. And if the experience that they have is they know that you're, really focused on how you're empowering that individual to, participate in better outcomes, we got to continue to reinforce that and provide the value. I think the other piece is that goes along with that is the ability to continue to offer studies and offer opportunities for people to participate in truly groundbreaking research. So as we have people that join our platform, the bulk of what we do is we do various research studies, and people have an opportunity to opt into those studies, separately, right? So research studies on Alzheimer's, on Parkinson's disease, so things that are really meaningful to individuals, the ability for them to participate in that and know that what we're working on is meaningful and is trying to have significant impact.
And then, so in terms of other challenges, one that I can think of is just in terms of data sharing. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on data sharing, or any other challenges that you're currently sort of facing and focusing on within your businesses. Eric?
When you say data sharing, can you elaborate what you mean by that?
So data sharing, when you're talking about that you're engaging with wider research centres in order to share your data, I was wondering if there's any challenges in terms of sharing data. Presumably you're doing on an anonymised basis, so there's a few challenges there, but are there any other challenges just in terms of collection of that data that would be helpful to draw upon for this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, as it relates to some of those arrangements, I mean, I think the hardest part with, depending upon the organization you're talking to, there's oftentimes IP questions over who owns what, depending on who's contributing, and some centers, let's say, have a very strong, I don't know, I guess, academic licensing or academic partnering teams that really drive incredibly difficult conversations. But that aside, I think the other really hard thing is that it's really deconvoluting noisy data, I think, is a huge challenge, and trying to control for confounding factors. I mean, there's a reason why, as we started this conversation, why scientists would use all male mice, right? It wasn't because they hate female mice, it's because the female cycle, it actually introduces a variability which is harder to control. It makes this experiments less sort of clean. And so, and if you take that and now extrapolate it into real life and all the messiness that we are on a day in and day out basis, there's just a lot of noise. And I think ultimately, as we start to think about collecting real world data, making sure you're getting accurate data, you're getting enough information to really to be able to control for confounding factors. It's just a challenge, right? And I think there's like the concept of crowdsourcing data is very compelling and it makes a ton of sense. But when you get into the actual real world implementation of that, it gets more challenging. But even if you just think about, a wearable device, a Fitbit versus an Apple Watch, you're like, all right, well, they all kind of collect about the same thing, but how variable is one algorithm versus the next, right? Which one is the ground truth? And if you're actually doing this across hundreds of different devices and many different people's perspectives of what's good, did I sleep well? I don't know what's good sleep for me versus good sleep for you. Maybe I think my good sleep is your terrible sleep, right? And so it just gets really hard, I think, when you actually think about the data you're collecting and how do you actually make sense of it all. And I think it's part of why you need a lot of it and many different kinds to be able to let the data science teams try to make sense of it all. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that all of us face.
I imagine accuracy, Riddy, is probably even more important when you're not just getting that data from a wearable, you're actually getting it from the individual who's responding to a question. So do you struggle with that? Are there sort of variables that you have to sort of counteract almost in your data set?
Yeah, I mean, to Eric's point, there's so much subjectivity in a lot of the phenomenon that everyone experiences. And so we try to control for that by using validated instruments as frequently as possible. So like, for example, for all of our mental health survey questions, those are based on actually validated survey instruments that have been developed in the field of psychiatry, for decades. And so by leveraging pre-existing tools that have been tested on big audiences and their robustness has sort of been validated, you can reduce some of that subjectivity, and we try to do that for as much of the survey as we can. So I think that's part of it. The other part, just to recall, is that we're also getting genomic data from the cells that we collect that we're pairing it with, which also helps to validate it, right? When you're getting a biological signal and you're pairing that with any sort of digital signal that you're trying to call for. The one thing that I would add to what Eric was saying was he's completely spot on. The same thing about data sharing. IP always becomes a super funny issue that comes up in terms of anyone who wants to collaborate. But I will say for us, one of the things that's been challenging is just trying to pick the projects that we want to collaborate on, because and that's one of the first ways we noticed the dearth of available collection methods and specific female reproductive efforts that are out there, especially ones that are tied to collecting molecular signals for any sort of particular condition is that there's just so many people that have reached out, and some it runs the gamut of conditions that we expected. So obviously any sort of endometriosis effort, ovarian cancer, there's some top hitters that we expected people would reach out to say, this is something that we'd love to data share on. But there are instances that, we're really surprised by, that people are like, hey, actually, this is something that we actually think a tampon would help disambiguate. And it wasn't in our wheelhouse, or at least in our vision map of here are the 50 things that we think we would want to go after. So I would say from a data sharing perspective, that's also become a challenge because we are a small startup. And so we don't have all the resources in the world. And so we just have to be extremely judicious about the collaborations and the data sharing efforts that we get involved with.
We've just got a couple more minutes. So Jill, I don't know if you had anything to add, just in terms of the challenges on the data you're collecting and facing.
I think that one of the key issues, or one of the challenges overall in terms of our real world evidence, is just the silos of data that exist. And to your point, and I think the ability to start to bring some of those together so that we can actually harness the power of the data that's out there. And as I look forward, I think one of the great things would be, to the extent that we can get traction on patient-mediated health data. So how do we help individuals, make it easy for them to actually have their health records that they can then share with other people, right? So is that the easiest way to kind of break down the silo? Because I think that becomes a little bit of the challenge, is how do you just kind of start to bring the data? We collect stuff that's specific to the individual, but there's obviously a lot of other information out there that, depending on what the use case is, becomes relevant.
Yeah, I think what we've learned from this is data is critical here. There's a dearth of it, but also there's, as Riddy was just mentioning, there's lots of people that want the data equally, and trying to find that balance, trying to get good data from people. You've both got a challenge in terms of transparency, but then also in the sharing of it. But I think with that, we're probably at time. So just to hand over, thank you very much to Riddy, Jill and Eric. I think it's been a great discussion, and handing you back to you, Becky. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kelly. And yeah, fantastic panel. What a way to finish the last 2 days. Without a doubt, data is both critical and at times contentious, given the conversations that we've had. But thank you so much for your insights and for your time today. It's been a really fantastic panel. And all that's left for me to say is, thank you to everyone that has participated over the last 2 days, whether that's panelists, moderators, attendees, our fantastic partners and sponsors. It's been brilliant to run these 2 days. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. But that's it for this year. Hopefully we'll all connect again soon. Do ensure that you sort of make those connections on and off the platform, and we'll speak again very soon. Thanks so much.